Nobody uses printers anymore. The individual behind the counter hadn't even bothered to look up when Berwick St James entered the computer shop.
Well, I do. I'm an author. I write short stories. I need them printed off for competitions. Competitions all over Britain.
Can't you send them by email? The person was hunched over some circuit board with a sizzling soldering iron, the steam from which was smarting Berwick's eyes.
I don't trust it. The World Wide Web. Who knows where my creations might end up when I press submit? I will not submit. I need a printer, as my old one has collapsed on me.
New or second hand?
Second hand, of course.
Laser or inkjet?
I just need a printer, not some gadget which faxes, copies, scans, or whatever. Berwick was feeling hot under the collar from having to justify himself to this person in this labyrinth of laptops, towers, and androids.
I think I can find you one. With that, the person unwrapped his lanky body from his office stool, towered over Berwick, it's in the cellar, and reached down to the wooden floor, pulled on an iron ring, revealing a square hole with wooden steps leading down into the darkness. Answer the phone if it should ring. Then he disappeared into the blackness.
What on earth was Berwick doing in this junk shop of computer parts? Someone must have given him the name, but he couldn't think who it was. He'd just found the address scribbled on a scrap of paper in his diary. He'd almost not found it down this poky little alleyway. But he needed a new printer, desperately. He was very pleased with his new story. This one would win. He was sure of it.
That's the one. The man was back, and a black box was plonked onto the counter between them. 25 quid. That's the mains lead, that's the connecting lead.
Berwick rushed home with his new purchase, eager to get it connected to his computer, and desperate to get away from that company of that strange man. Immediately, there was a click. So that was good news. Then a clunk. That was a bit strange.
And then a whirring. It must be all right.
And then there was a swirl.
Hey, wait a minute, he muttered. I've not connected you to my... But before he could finish, something, somewhere, was being printed off.
The paper tray was hidden somewhere deep inside, but there was a sheet of paper appearing out of one of the slots at the front. What's going on? He shouted at the machine. I haven't! The printer threw a piece of text across the room, and then another. This must be some old document, still stored in the printer's memory. Some document that the previous owner hadn't bothered to get printed, but why? Who knows? Who cares? There was another page, and then another. Curiosity made Berwick pick them up and look at them. He shuffled them into a neat pile. The printer had come to rest by now. There were about 10 pages, all numbered. It was a short story. A story about... He began to read it. He became engrossed. No, he couldn't deny it. It was very good. No, he'd go even further. He hadn't read, let alone written, anything like it. It was quality. He sat back in awe. But who had written it? He looked at the front page. No name. Simply anonymous. His mind was racing. Perhaps... No, that was not right. But it was such a good story, and the original author, he or she, hadn't bothered about it, but had left it in the printer. And why had that happened? Had they died before?
At first, his conscience got the better of him. He phoned the computer shop to see if they had a record of the previous owner. If they did, then he'd get in touch. But then, of course, if they didn't, he phoned. The line was dead. Completely dead. He phoned the operator to be told that the number had been discontinued over a year before.
As he put the phone down, he remembered that the person had told him to answer the phone if it rang. But if the phone had been discontinued, what was going on? Oh, this was ridiculous. He'd been in the shop. He'd met the owner. He'd bought a printer. It was there on the computer table next to his screen and keyboard. Oh, well, he tried. Perhaps he could go back to the shop, of course. But no. He had bought the printer in good faith, and it had printed a short story that no one seemed to own, except him. He'd done his best to track and trace, but all to no avail. The story was now his, to do with what he liked. And what he liked was to send it off to that short story competition in that writing magazine. But what about his own story? Well, it paled into insignificance comparison. It took a month before the magazine got back to him. And it had won. There was a cheque to prove it, and it was going to be published in the next edition. And they wanted more to publish independently. He'd done it. He'd broken through. He was on his way. He was going to be a success.
Then his euphoria came crashing down.
He hadn't written the winning story, the breakthrough one. Oh well, perhaps that was not the point. Now, obviously, they would read the rest of his work with a new eye. They would be more sympathetic in future, something that they'd never been before. He'd send them that other short story, the one that he'd written. He found it on the computer, and the printer worked fine. Collating the pages, he began to check through the opening lines. Hey, wait a minute. He read again.
Looked at his computer screen and back at the printed page. They were different. The words, phrases, paragraphs even. They were similar, but not quite the same. It was his story, yes, but not the one that he'd written.
In the printed version, it was good. Better than his own. It was different. And an improvement. But how come? Who'd interfered? Who'd thought that they knew better? Who'd looked closely at the printer? Could it be the printer, this box of diodes and wires and such, could it be that the printer had a mind of its own? No. It was a machine. A simple, functioning machine. You give it something to print and it prints it off. That's how it works. It doesn't change things. It doesn't edit. And it certainly shouldn't be able to improve on the original.
He didn't drink. His mind was all over the place. It was difficult to comprehend. No, stop. This must be a fluke. There must be a glitch between the computer and the printer. There must be a gremlin in the works.
This was a one-off. He'd got that poem ready for that rather prissy little poetry magazine that only printed 4 editions a year to a select readership.
He found Ode to a Dying Day in Autumn, just about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The title was longer than the poem itself.
He found the key print, and the printer whirled into action. But this time, rather than fling the printed page out as the others had done, this time it printed it slowly, hesitatingly, as though it was composing some new lines. He picked up the result. Predicament. Well, that was perhaps a better title, and the poem was, well, An improvement. In fact, not just an improvement on the original, but a completely new poem. It wasn't the one that he'd sweated and strained over. It was emotional, where his had been dull. It was intense, where his had been boring. It was a proper poem. This time, he had no soul-searching, no thoughts of authorship. He sent it off.
They were over the moon. More, they wanted more. They would advertise their new find. That would bring in more subscribers, and it did. Especially that review in the London Review of Books.
What can we say? Where has he been hiding all these years?
Then, the 10-minute play for that Welsh competition. A huge success! Theatre companies up and down the British Isles wanted more, wanted original pieces, one-act plays, full-length ones. The National Theatre and the Royal Shakespeare Company were bidding for the next work from this newly discovered talent. To keep up with the demand, he was having to search deeper and deeper into his archived work. And then that ran out. Then he had to write new stuff. A bit of a bore, really, for now he was having to work for a living.
But it didn't matter. Whatever he wrote, whatever odd collection of words he typed into the computer, when it came out of the printer, it was pure gold. Then suddenly, one day, the message flashed up.
Ink out. Well, there was always that cheap place that sent inks through the post. He phoned them and asked about the model of his printer. They found one near to it. It seemed that they didn't stock that particular model. But of course, if the inks fitted into the slot, well, what the hell? He gave his order to cheap ink and waited. The new inks couldn't come fast enough. He was getting impatient, and all the while the printer was standing idly by. Finally, the 4 inks arrived, vacuum-packed in their tough plastic sheets. He ripped them open, threw out the old ones, and rammed in the new. There, all done. 4 inks well and truly replaced.
He went back onto the computer. He would soon be aiming for the Booker Prize with his new novel, but before that, he tapped print. The printer refused to print. It announced that it did not recognise the new inks, and it could not guarantee the quality, etc., etc. The inks may damage the machine, etc., etc. Oh, this is ridiculous. Damn the bloody machine. He was the master here. So, when he was presented with the dismiss button, he pressed it. Are you sure? Yes or no? Of course he was sure. He pressed yes. And the printer reluctantly spluttered into life and slowly began to print out the story. The story for that major magazine who had been clamouring for months. Well, it did print out the story. Good story, excellent story. Printed in that cheap ink, but still perfectly adequate to read. Buy expensive inks, he muttered as he slid the pages into the envelope.
It was just 5 days later that the solicitor's letter arrived. The letter accusing him of plagiarism. He was going to be sued by the original author, who had been given a preview of the story that Berwick had offered to the major magazine.
Plagiarism? But how could that be? It was an original story. He could guarantee it. He'd written it. And then he paused. What was going on here? He hadn't much time to think about it before another solicitor's letter arrived, and then another, and another, each of them threatening to take him to court, unless, of course, he settled out of court. And finally, that article he'd written about the royal family, or rather the article that the printer had written. going to sue him for libel. That was when he took to the hills and didn't stop until the train lines ran out, leaving behind fame and fortune. Let someone else have that. And leaving behind that story, left unprinted in the printer's memory. That's the end. But although this story may just seem a fabrication, it was printed by a black and brooding printer with fresh new inks.